Great, thank you, Adam. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martin Schonteich, and I work for the Open Society Justice Initiative, which is a not-for-profit organization and works primarily on rights-based law reform projects globally around the world on a variety of issues, but also criminal justice reform, and in particular pretrial justice reform, which is the area in which I work. And most of our criminal justice work takes place in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Eastern Europe, and the countries of the former Soviet Union. I'm going to speak to you today about the socioeconomic impact of pretrial detention on children and their families, based primarily on the research which we've done over the last few years in 6 different African countries, but we'll also draw on some other research findings and information that is available to us. Before I get into the details of the research, I thought I would just say a little bit about the extent of pretrial detention around the world, because it's very often not recognized to what extent pretrial detention is used excessively or arbitrarily. So we know from the International Center of Prison Studies that around the world, on an average day, there are about 10 million people who are imprisoned. And roughly a third of those, just under a third, 32%, are pretrial detainees. These are called different things in different jurisdictions: remandees, awaiting trial detainees, under trials, basically people who've been arrested, who've been remanded to pretrial detention, and are awaiting trial or the finalization of their trial. The proportion of prisoners who are pretrial detainees, as you can see from the slide, varies from region to region somewhat. The global average, as I said, is 32%. It's higher in many parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and somewhat lower in Europe and in this part of the world. There are, however, quite a number of jurisdictions where the majority of all prisoners are pretrial detainees. Sort of from the extreme of Liberia and Mali, where around 90% or more of all prisoners are awaiting trial or the finalization of their trial, to places like Nigeria or India, where it's around 70% or 3/4 of all prisoners, or Bangladesh, 2/3. And it becomes apparent that in those countries, trials are quite a rare occurrence. Typically, the period of pretrial detention is a punishment for those individuals. Relatively few people who end up in the criminal justice system end up being convicted. But even in developed countries, where data is available on this, so take England and Wales, for example, even a country like that, where the criminal justice system is very well resourced, there are enough lawyers and prosecutors and courtrooms to process people expeditiously through the system, we know from data collected there that a bit over half of all pretrial detainees end up either being acquitted of the offenses against them, or if they are convicted, are given a non-custodial sentence because the charges against them are fairly trifling in nature. So I think there's a case to be made that very often pretrial detention is used rather excessively. Another way of looking at it, beyond sort of the pure numbers, is sort of the human consequences or human costs of the excessive use of pretrial detention. In many jurisdictions, there's simply no data as to the duration of pretrial detention. So we just don't know how long the average duration is in many places. But we've tried to cobble together some sort of global average to the best extent of our knowledge. We know, for example, that within the Council of Europe countries, the average duration of pretrial detention is about 4.5 months. It's much higher in a place like Nigeria, for example, where it's well over 3 years, and I think many jurisdictions fall somewhere in between that. If we accept that, then we can calculate that the present cohort of pretrial detainees, those 3 million people who are at the moment awaiting trial, that cohort will collectively spend about 660 million person days awaiting trial. Technically, they're presumed innocent. Indeed, many of them are innocent and will never end up being convicted. And many of them shouldn't be there because even after they're convicted, they're given a non-custodial sentence. There are a number of consequences of the excessive use of pretrial detention. One is obviously the detention of the innocent. It's one of those universal rights which everybody gives lip service to, but is significantly disregarded in practice in the way that criminal justice systems function on a day-to-day basis. Pretrial detention centers in particular serve as vectors in the spread of disease, often even more so than places which incarcerate sentenced prisoners. Now, in many countries, these are mixed populations, so there's not a big difference. But in countries where they are separate, often pretrial detention centers are exceptionally overcrowded compared to the prison system as a whole. It's also more of a transient population, so there's a higher turnover of personnel. And because prison authorities argue that the main task is really to look after sentenced prisoners and to try and rehabilitate those who've been convicted of crimes, they tend to spend much fewer resources on pretrial detainees. So long-term medication for malaria, tuberculosis, or HIV/AIDS in countries which have limited resources, while they would be given to sentenced prisoners, would not be made accessible to pretrial detainees. Abuse and torture is particularly rife amongst pretrial detention populations, because in many countries the police and prosecution, they have an instrumental reason to abuse pretrial detainees because they want to get them to make a confession or an admission, which will make it easier for them to get a conviction at the end of the day. Corruption also tends to be disproportionately focused at the pretrial stage of the criminal justice process. It's at the pre-trial stage where police, prosecutors, and judges are endowed with a lot of discretion, whether to arrest somebody or not, what to arrest them for, whether to charge them, whether to prosecute them, what to prosecute them for, whether to grant them bail or not. And all these discretion points obviously allow for corruption and bribery to infiltrate the system. And then aggravated household poverty, which I'm going to go into a bit more detail now. So what are the factors that lead to detention? And we generally say it's sort of the 3 Bs. It's people who are unable to pay bail, unable to pay a bribe, or unable to afford a barrister or a lawyer. It's generally the poor who end up in pretrial detention. And that's both in developed countries and developing countries. There's not really a big difference between the two. Now, there are a lot of costs associated with pretrial detention, obviously for states, but also for the detainees themselves and their families and their children, and I'll speak to that in a moment. But I think it's important to point out that many of the costs which accrue to the state in developed countries, where the state is responsible for clothing and feeding detainees, giving them medication if they're ill, sorry, those are expenses which generally in poorer countries, states do not come up with. So that cost is really just passed on to the families of detainees. It's those families who have to bring soap and clothing and medication and food and drinkable water to their detained relatives because the state is simply unwilling or unable to pay for that. So what are the impacts on individuals? Obviously, it's a very direct impact in terms of income and employment. People lose their employment once they are detained. And while formal employment rates tend to be fairly low in developing countries, especially in many parts of Africa, it's surprising, and you'll see the data in a moment, how many people who are detained did earn an income at the time of their arrest, not as formal employees, but they were selling goods at the market, they were working on a subsistence farm, they were trading in livestock, or whatever the case may be, but they were earning an income for their household. Second impact on individuals, obviously, is a health impact, and that can be quite severe, especially in countries with high levels of infectious diseases, which are often significantly aggravated in a prison or remand environment. And then obviously education, especially for children and youth, either if they themselves are detained or if their caregivers or parents are detained. What are the impacts on families? And families obviously pay the price in 2 ways, really. One, not only do they have to make up for the lost income of the person who's been detained, but they themselves, as I already alluded to, suffer some direct economic costs or punishment, bringing food and clothing and medication to their detained relative, but also paying for transport expenses, paying for a lawyer, paying bribes to get access to their detained relative, or whatever the case might be. These are all very real expenses, especially for poor and marginalized families. Often what happens, at least in our research, we found that households, once the detention period is over a longer period of time, they begin to sell household goods to pay for detention-related costs. So they would sell a cow or a goat or some sheep or a tractor if it's a more well-to-do family. And that can really set back those families for a long period of time, because these are income-generating assets, which are in essence being sold. And it often takes families long periods of time to recuperate those losses. Education, which can have really an intergenerational effect, as children's education is disrupted because they're taken out of school to try and make up for the income lost of their retained father or uncle, or whatever the case might be. And for children to go back into education after somebody's been released from detention is often more difficult than one would like. Just to give you one sort of case study or one example that we found in Mozambique, where the male head of the household was arrested, and what the family did, they sold a maize milling machine to cover the cost of legal fees, bail, and bribes. And that machine was not only used for the family for its own purposes, but also was rented out to other members of the community of the village to mill their maize, and as a result brought about a steady income to the family. So as a result of that loss of income, because the machine had been sold, there was no money to buy new seed or hire labor to work on the farm, so it really set back the income earning potential of the farm as a whole, which was the livelihood of that family. But also crops were lost, so it had a long-term detrimental impact. But also the community more broadly suffered as a consequence, because a woman in that community had to go back to pounding grain manually. But let me go into some of the data from the research that we've done. So the first series of countries we selected were Ghana, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, and this was research which was done in 2012. And it was quite interesting to us when we found out who was a typical detainee, because the demographic profile was very often quite different to what is the case in many Western developed countries. These were not really people on the margins of society. They were typically married men in their 30s, breadwinners earning at least the minimum monthly wage of these countries. They had an average level of education, but supporting a large group of dependents, typically school-aged children and or elderly parents and relatives. But they were really at the prime income generating age, and indeed in most cases were earning an income for their households. So for the families, not only did they lose support of a breadwinner, but they fell deeper into poverty, with less food and higher debts. They typically or very often had to sell household goods, and in certain cases, and I'll give you the figures in a moment, children were taken out of school. They had to give up school. The lack of income exacerbated by expenses incurred by families traveling to and from prison, providing food and medication, and paying bribes and legal fees. And often these are not great amounts in New Zealand dollars or in US dollars. It's maybe $2 or $3 for transport to the prisons. But over many weeks and over many months and years, that really adds up, taken in combination with the loss of the breadwinning capacity of the detainee. So to give you some data, so from these different countries, the vast majority of detainees, as you can see, were economically active at the time of the arrest. 94% in Sierra Leone, over 80% in Ghana and Guinea. The minority were formally employed. They didn't get a salary, but they were typically street merchants, working on a farm somewhere, trading in livestock, those kinds of income-generating activities which are fairly typical to these kinds of countries. As you can see, a fair proportion of families had to sell household goods, around about a fifth, a bit less in Ghana, but otherwise around about a fifth of families. Quite a variety in terms of the families that fell into debt, from a low of 12% in Sierra Leone, but almost half in Ghana and about a third in Guinea. Children had to give up school, 6% in Sierra Leone, but almost a bit over 1 out of 10 in the other two countries. And I just put in there that the vast majority of these individuals had not seen a lawyer by the time they were interviewed, even though they had been in detention for quite a long period of time. Just to give you a sense of the proportion of detainees who fell ill after the arrest, very high proportions, over 80% or more in all the countries. And it really ranged from scabies and skin disease because of the overcrowding and lack of nutrition, tuberculosis, malaria, a lot of infectious diseases which often would linger for these people because they were not treated very well in the detention system for many years to come, really undermining their future earning capacity and productivity as well, And also in case of infectious diseases, there would always be the risk that once they were released, or even if not, if they were to meet with their children, relatives in the prison environment, that would pass on those infections to others, which would obviously have a negative economic impact on those families. We then repeated these studies, moved away from West Africa and looked at Kenya, Mozambique, and Zambia in 2014, improved the design somewhat, bigger samples. We tried to focus in on female detainees, because there aren't many women who are detained in Africa, but we wanted to get enough data on them as well to disaggregate some of the findings in respect of them. And also spent more time and effort to try and interview household members to get the perspective of members of the households of detainees as well. Some of the findings were similar. People in the late 20s and early 30s were the typical age group of detainees. They were also typically breadwinners, earning around the minimum wage of those countries, with average levels of education, and again, often supporting very large group of dependents. Certainly in Africa, children would include nephews and nieces, often cousins as well, so an extended family network. And if somebody is a young adult who's a breadwinner and earns a decent income, very often would look after not only his biological children, but also nephews and cousins in certain cases as well. So the number of dependents can be quite high. Some of the comparative findings, a very high proportion of economically active detainees again. In Kenya, all claimed that they were in one way or another economically active at the time of their arrest, less so Mozambique, and in Zambia around 2/3. Detainees with minor dependents, it ranged by the gender of the detainee somewhat. Amongst males, it was sort of in the upper 70s, low 80%. Amongst female detainees, from 100% in Kenya down to 71% in Zambia. And as I said, not necessarily their biological children, but children that were dependent on them at the time of their arrest. A very interesting finding, I thought, was detainees' contribution to median household income. In other words, what proportion did the detainees at the time of their arrest contribute to the income of the household in which they lived? And it was high. It was ranged from 50% in Zambia, but 2/3 in Kenya and 70% in Mozambique. So it was really a significant setback, financially speaking, to these households once the individuals had been arrested and detained. A broad range of families that had to sell household goods, from 22% in Kenya to well over 50% in Zambia and Mozambique. Unsurprisingly, quite a number of families fell into debt, around a third of those. Some health data as well, not as bad as in West Africa, but still quite high. We were able to disaggregate it between male and female, but generally well over half of detainees fell ill after their arrest, again with potentially long-term consequences, not only for themselves, but for their families as well. Just to give you a sense of the duration of pretrial detention. So in the first two countries, Kenya and Mozambique, the data we could collect was given to us in such a way that we could only count the period of detention from 2 years before the research began. So we couldn't count anybody who was in detention for longer than two years. But nevertheless, even in those two countries, the median duration of detention was quite long, 122 days in Kenya, over 300 days, almost a year in Mozambique. And then the 75th percentile, the top quarter, or the quarter of detainees who were in detention for the longest period of time, was over 200 days in Kenya and well over a year in Mozambique. In Zambia, where we didn't have that methodological limitation, the median duration of detention, or the 57th percentile, was quite long. People really spend months, if not even years, in pretrial detention in these kinds of countries. So what are some of the conclusions we can draw? Again, I think it was surprising to us that most detainees are really ordinary individuals, people integrally involved in supporting their families. Typically, they were charged with theft, often theft by servant, which is a very common crime in these countries, or ordinary theft or stock theft, which is treated quite seriously, robbery to a certain extent, also murder. I mean, there were certainly some people within that group who were charged with very serious offenses, but that generally wasn't the norm. The norm was sort of theft, minor robbery type of offenses. It wasn't longitudinal enough, the study, so we don't know what the outcome was of these individual cases, what proportion were convicted, and if convicted, what kind of sentence they got. but certainly the charge against them were in many cases not overly serious. We also concluded that the criminal justice system punishes through undermining the socioeconomic rights of detainees and their families. And the many rights that people have, a right to earn an income, a right to a house, a right to a comfortable living space or safe living space, all these sort of rights are undermined in many ways, not only in respect of detainees who at the end of the day might be innocent of the charges against them, but certainly in respect of their families who, for all accounts, are completely innocent. The socioeconomic impact of pretrial detention is multidimensional and spread quite unevenly across individuals and households. Again, I think somebody else spoke about it today, the resilience factor. So some families, they have a broader support network who survive quite well, but many families, especially those with large groups of minor dependents or who live far away from the detainee, who incur a lot of transport-related expenses, for example, their security, their financial security is undermined fairly quickly as a result of the detention of their household member. In some cases, the socioeconomic impact of pretrial detention is rather enduring, especially when people are taken out of school and forgo education, or when people are fall ill in respect of quite a serious illness, which really undermines their productivity for many years or for the remainder of their life course. The impact is really long-term and intergenerational. And I think it stands to reason that children are extremely vulnerable to changes in the socioeconomic position of the household. Very often it falls on the children to be taken out of school, to work on a subsistence farm in the household, or to go to the market and try and sell goods, and whatever the case might be, to try and compensate somewhat for the loss of income. Just very quickly, and I don't want to go into the details, but I think there's a sort of an advocacy opportunity in respect of the kinds of arguments that I've made. So in 2015, the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, what came after the Millennium Development Goals, to combat poverty around the world. But these goals now are much broader. They're not purely poverty focused, but also incorporate a number of goals which are about security and the rule of law and public safety and so forth. And one of them, Goal 16, which focuses around rule of law issues and equal access to justice for all, also incorporates within it a pretrial detention indicator. And I think that's politically fairly significant, that at a global level, there seems to be a political recognition that there is a linkage between pretrial detention on the one hand and socioeconomic development and socioeconomic rights on the other. I mean, anything to do with the UN, this is a long, laborious process. But certainly one of our objectives over the coming probably 5 to 10 years is to try and engage with governments, with international aid organizations, to try and invest more in pretrial detention-related reforms, making a socioeconomic argument, which is fairly novel. In the past, it was always about efficiencies and public security and safety, but I think we now have a growing body of evidence that one can make a socioeconomic argument, while pretrial detention reforms, from a rights perspective, are really important. So, if I may, I'm just going to show you a 4-minute video, which I think is quite instructive because it encapsulates many of the things I spoke about in maybe a bit of a dry way, just giving you lots of data. It's a story of a young family in Malawi, where the head of the household was detained, and you will see from the video what impact it had on his young family.
Ende Vintengagalidze, ndimagula ntchito yolima, ndini zaka 21.
My name is Vintengagalidze and I am 21 years old and I am a farmer.
Ndine Fulainesi, ndine mkazi wa Vintenga, ndine zaka 18.
I am Flyness and I am the wife of Vintenga. I am 18 years old.
Chimanga, sawa.
We grow tobacco, vegetables, groundnuts, soya beans, and these are the products which I sell. What happened is that I was at a place where I was selling roasted meat. Somebody got my meat and he didn't want to pay me. I just talked to him very strongly, but I didn't beat him up. They said I caused this breach of the peace. Then I was locked up in a cell at Kanengo police station. There was no food provided in the police cell. The only food I used to get was the food that was being brought from here by my wife or my mother.
Nimesetsa kuti lero nditapita mwina ni
I used to pay him a visit every other day. I would leave this place around 7 in the morning and come back around 3 p.m. I knew that if I didn't go with food, then he would have no food.
kukanengoona khawo mwezi umodzi kumaula miyezi itatu.
I was in the police custody for 24 days. Thereafter, I was transferred to Maula prison, where I sat for 2 months.
kumaula tonkone kuti kuli
The first day I entered the prison cell, it was so congested. They piled us up like sacks of anything. And we had no chance to get water. We had no chance to get any food. And then that night, I didn't sleep. I kept standing the whole night. This was a very difficult moment for me because I thought I would die there anytime.
ukutsikira ni filikolo kumtazira ukasoma 8 koloko.
nimalimako ndime ziwiri.
I was forced to work maybe double the work I would do when my husband was here.
Nimesetsa
It was very difficult for me to live alone because I had nothing.
ndagulitsa TV.
I sold the television set, our bicycle, a goat, and a cow.
Ng'ombe ziwiri.
amafuna kwenekwene amafuna samale moyo wanga niso imene
They had to sacrifice all this because they wanted to save my life. And for me to get out, it was because of these paralegal officers.
abungwe ngati apalaligwa.
One day when I went there, I came across him. I came across his file. I saw that it was not reasonable enough to keep such a person in prison. So we wanted the magistrate to give his discretion as to what should happen to Vintenga. By chance, the magistrate granted him bail, and then now he's at home on bail. If we didn't intervene, it's very possible he would have still been in custody up to this time. But he's reporting to a police station which is 50 kilometers from his village. And it's very expensive for him to travel all this way. So I feel this is still having a big impact on his life.
panopani pamavuto kwambiri futi china yonse chidasokonezera.
I'm in a very hard situation this time because even though we are approaching the farming season again, I cannot manage to buy fertilizer to apply to my garden.
tidakhala kuti mwina pakhomo pano.
Looking at the way we were living before my husband was arrested, I thought at one time we would live in an iron sheet house and we would be able to eat well.
pasi ndangoti pamene pasachitika.
My husband's arrest made me lose hope of all the future. What we were dreaming had come to a doom. Now I'm thinking that though we are poor, slowly we'll start again, rebuilding our family.
pano timankhalako kuti bola moyo pano.
Great. Well, thank you for your attention. I think we've run out of time. I'll be here for a few more minutes if anybody has any questions. But thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it.